All right. Let me give you some background. The 19th century. In the 19th century, America and Europe had reached a place of stability, right? All of them had entered their let me back up. Politically, all of them had gone through their French revolutions for France, the Glorious Revolution in England. Italy had unified. Germany had unified. America had had its Civil War and figured out what they were going to do with slavery, abolish it. So politically, they had worked out some type of peace at home. There wasn't this whole series of endless revolutions, right? Political stability at home. Economically, the West, defined as Europe and America, all had entered into the Industrial Revolution. They weren't just starting it, they were deep into it. They were technologically more advanced than most of the rest of the nations. Not smarter, just ahead chronologically. Which means you can transport your goods anywhere around the world. You can get natural resources from anywhere around the world. And most importantly, you can transport your military anywhere around the world, whether it's the Army, the Marine Corps, or the Navies. And you can impose your will anywhere around the world. And they can't fight back. This is what I want us to focus on today. Here's us, the US. Here's Europe over here. This is the area I'm focusing on today, East Asia. China, Japan. This is Korea, this is Manchuria. These were all part of China at one time and they all lost it. This is the one thing I want you to take from this map, all right? The distance from the US to Japan, thousands of miles over the open ocean. The distance from Europe to China and Japan, thousands of miles through the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, etc. The Industrial Revolution allowed these nations to travel over these thousands of miles with their trade, but also to impose their political and economic desires far from home because of these technological advancements. And by the way, Britain is this little island right here, right? This little island conquered all of this, China, in the Opium War. Why? Incredible technological differences. All right? This is a close-up of East Asia, what I'm talking about today. Japan, China over there. These are some of the other territories conquered by Europeans. India, Burma by the British. Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos by the French. The Portuguese had some territory down here as well. The Germans, and up here, Japanese and Russian conquests. All right, so why were China and Japan so vulnerable to Western conquest? Basically, they were weak. A poor population, hungry, declining agriculture, which is where most of their money came from, which meant declining revenues. When governments don't have money, they can't modernize, they can't invest, their militaries are weak. The governments were also very corrupt, incapable of responding to Western intervention. All of this, an unsympathetic population, because remember, both of these countries were ruled very much the way the Middle Ages was in Europe. A few people controlling all the good land, the elites, the nobles. The majority of the people below them, uneducated, poor, no access to land, no voting rights or political rights. And that frustration mixed with famine is a combustible mixture. So lack of support at home, lack of income, weak militaries, and then the West comes calling, looking for access to your markets. So let's start off with China. The role of China in the early 19th century is exactly the same as the role of China today. Meaning, it's a big country, billions of people live there, so anybody who wants to do business overseas says, we got to do business with China. There's just too many people there to ignore. Well, what if we disagree with the way the government is running their country? Doesn't matter. There's too many people there to ignore. If we don't get in on the Chinese market, somebody else will. That kind of compromise, that we just want to do business with China, we don't care how, was what motivated Westerners to do business with China back then. Big country, the West is expanding it's economically, they need access to customers, they need access to natural resources, they want to get in by any means necessary. The Chinese, however, didn't want Western trade. Why? The Chinese felt Western culture and Western trade was quote-unquote barbaric. The Chinese claimed that their civilization was far more advanced. And on some level they had a point, because the culture we know as China, the country we know as China, has been around for thousands of years. It is the longest continuous history of a civilization in the history of the world. No other civilization has lasted as long as China. The entire culture of East Asia is rooted in China, its language, its religion, etc. So they ignored Western trade, Western ideas. Well, what does that mean? It means the Chinese invented gunpowder, but the Europeans perfected it. The Chinese were long-distance sea voyagers. They explored the east coast of Africa way before the Westerners did, but then they turned their backs on the West and overseas exploration just when Westerners were expanding that. What's that?
That's good. Because then we'll be speaking Chinese right now.
Possibly. Possibly. But, you know, it's not like English is an easy language to learn. Neither is Chinese, yes. But what I'm saying is historically, you know what? Did you get your stuff prepared for today? You did not. Sit there and stay awake. Now, in order to limit this trade between the West and China, the Chinese simply made it inconvenient. All Westerners could only trade in one port. And if you do manage to unload your stuff, you can only deal with a few firms approved by the government. The whole point is keep Western products and Westerners and their ideas out of the country. Fine. Well, why is this a problem? Well, because the West needs access. Their economies demand customers. And the other problem was this lack of interest in Western products meant people who traded with China because they felt that these Chinese products fetched good money back home. Chinese tea, porcelain, silk, whatever. The way you do trade is you load up your boat with stuff from home, you sail to China, you unload it, sell it, then you pick up stuff from China, load it up your boat, bring it back home, sell it. The goal is never to have an empty ship. Why? Because then you have no cargo to sell, but you're still paying for maintenance, your crew, etc. You understand what I'm saying? But the Chinese weren't buying anything from the West. So the European merchants and Americans would go in, they would pay for things out of their own pocket, making them cash poor, go back home, sell it, and then with their empty ships go back to China, basically. You understand what I'm saying? It drained their operating budgets until they found something that they could sell illegally in China. And then they could take Chinese currency, put it in their pocket, instead of losing their money by always having to purchase things with their own currency. Opium. In the 19th century, Britain was in the process of consolidating its empire in India. The Indian colony of Britain included at the time Afghanistan and Bangladesh. Fields and fields of poppies were growing at this part of the world, from which you derived opium, from which you derived the idea of selling it in China. Because as we know, drugs sell. So does porn. But before the invention of the video, there was opium. The British found a way to unload this stuff, sell it illegally on the black market, and now all of a sudden, it wasn't British merchants losing their currency to buy Chinese products to sell back home. Now British merchants could unload their opium, and they could collect Chinese silver or currency. This was a problem for the Chinese government. Money was flowing out of the country into foreigners' hands, making China less and less wealthy. Additionally, the spread of opium sale in the south of China, where it was coming in, led to widespread drug addiction and crime. So the Chinese responded. In 1839, the government seized and destroyed 20,000 chests of opium. Tell me this. When was the last time a group of people destroyed British property in this class? And how did the British respond to the destruction of Boston, of the British tea? The Intolerable Acts, which then eventually led to Declaration of Independence in the war, right? Same thing here. The British government responded quickly and harshly to the interruption of their trade. They went to war with China to force the Chinese government to allow them to sell opium. So in case the analogy escapes you, this would be the equivalent of Colombia and Mexico invading the United States to force us to stop our war on drugs and being successful at it. That's what Britain did to China. Got it? Well, the British, being so technologically superior, managed to defeat China very quickly, on land, at sea, and once the Chinese fell so easily to the British, all these other nations came in to similarly defeat China in war and impose on them what are known as unequal treaties. Why are they unequal? Because the victor imposed humiliating treaties on the loser. Britain specifically issued the Treaty of Nanking, or Nanjing. They took territory from China, Hong Kong, which was only given back in, I think, 1997. I can't be sure. All ports were open to British trade, not just that one port at the south of China. British trade was supposed to be given most favored nation status by the Chinese government. But this is the one that really showed how little control China had over its own country. They signed a treaty that said all British subjects in China are not susceptible to Chinese laws. What does that mean? It means if you commit a crime as defined as a crime in China by Chinese laws, the Chinese authorities cannot arrest you, and they can't put you on trial. Because the government has signed this treaty that says British subjects will not be punished under Chinese law. As an equivalent, imagine every tourist who comes to New York City that didn't have to obey New York City or American or New York State laws. They could park wherever they want.
You mean like a diplomat?
Like a diplomat. But every single tourist was immune to the enforcement of any law. That is what the British imposed on China. And everybody else did the same thing as well. The US, Japan, France, Germany, even the smaller countries went to China and imposed these unequal treaties. Now, the combination of humiliation at the hands of these foreign powers, A, plus the previous problems, poverty, lack of access to land, lack of access to political power, means the people, by and large, have virtually no respect or hope in their government to improve their quality of life. The result, when people are upset, they rebel. And then you get this, a whole series of rebellions which cripple China, which makes it even less capable of resisting foreign domination. Rebellions in the northeast, the southwest, and the northwest, which take place consecutively and some on top of the other between the 1850s and 1870s, all further weakening China. But the worst one was this, the Taiping Rebellion. Lasted about 15 years, was all over the country. It took up to 20 to 30 million dead to put it down. And what made this most dangerous was that it was a rebellion that was more than just, we, the people, are hungry and we want to stop being hungry. People had a plan. They were organized. They didn't want more food. They wanted to know why food was so expensive in the first place. They wanted to know why they had no ability to influence their lives. They were thinking about not just getting more food, but reforming Chinese society so that no suffering would take place in the future. So they had an idea. Abolish private property. Why? Because their understanding was when you have private property, the few control the best land and everybody else suffers. Wealth should be shared according to what people need, not simply how much you can afford and how much you can grab. Everyone has a right to a basic standard of living. Everyone has a human right not to starve, essentially. They targeted certain aspects of Chinese culture which were deemed incredibly oppressive, and they were. Foot binding, the binding of young women's feet so that as the bones grew, they grew long and slender, which was considered attractive. But this was only done to poor women. Concubinage, the maintenance of many women for sex. Again, this was imposed on poor women. Free public education. If you want to reform Chinese society, you must raise up the masses by educating them. And we need democracy, the vote. We need a modern industrial society, not just an agricultural society. Who else did you read for me recently that said that private property, that capitalism was the root of all evil and it should be abolished? Karl Marx. Does anybody remember when Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto was published? Does anybody happen to remember? No? What? 48. 1848. So imagine this. 1848, Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto was published that says capitalism and private property must be abolished to end all oppression. 2 years later, the Taiping Rebellion breaks out. One of its founding motivating ideas is the problems with private property. Did these people read Karl Marx? I don't know. Did they come to these ideas all by themselves because there was a broad recognition that private property is a problem? I don't know. But it's a remarkable coincidence, is what I'm saying. This was put down. 20 to 30 million died in the process. Agriculture was further destroyed in the process of this rebellion, which meant food was even more scarce. Famine went up. The people suffered more. And the Chinese government required Western help to get hold of their country, making them more in debt to the West. How did they respond? The response was, we are being defeated, taken over, exploited by the West because they are technologically superior. What can we do? What can we do to regain our independence? We must learn from them. We must copy the best from them. So, they tried this. The self-strengthening movement. We need modern shipyards because we need international trade. We need railroads so that we can build on our internal markets. We need modern weapons to defend China from foreign incursion. We've got to produce our own steel, the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. And finally, we need to raise academic standards to produce the next generation of entrepreneurs and innovators. This was a failure. Good ideas, poor implementation. Tell me this. What happens when you start modernizing your economy? When people start moving from the countryside into the cities and working in factories? What happened in Europe when you had the Industrial Revolution? What class rose up demanding change? Them too, but later. What was the first group that got wealthy from the Industrial Revolution? The bourgeoisie, the middle class. They demanded, now that they have this wealth from the Industrial Revolution, why don't they have political power? Next thing you know, what do we have? The French Revolution. The elimination of absolute monarchy. A society based on equal access to rights. Everyone is a citizen. The Chinese were concerned that if they modernized too quickly, the organization of society where the few control the best land and all the political power up the top, and the rest are subservient to them, that will crumble overnight. And it would have. So they did not do as much of this as they could have. What was the result? Few reforms of Chinese society itself, limited strengthening from the self-strengthening movement. China remains weak, and so the Europeans and the Americans take this and they exploit it. They increase their influence in China by creating spheres of influence. This is a map of China by the beginning of the 20th century. The dark green are the territories the Chinese government actually has control over. The Russians up here, the British here, here, and along the Yangtze River, the French here, the Germans here. All of them have imposed spheres of influence in China. What does that mean? Did they take over the land? Did they make it a colony? No. They forced the government of China to allow them to develop those territories, build railroads, mine the natural resources, and to profit from it. This type of exploitation eventually led to Lorenzo, the Boxer Rebellion. What is it? Talk to me about it.
The Boxer Rebellion, also known as the Boxer Uprising, was a violent anti-foreign and anti-Christian movement which took place in China towards the end of the Qing dynasty between the 1898 and 1900. This movement was started by the militia united in righteousness and was motivated by opposition to foreign imperialism and Christianity. The Boxers, or Yi Hozhan, with the help of the Imperial Army of China, were able to take control of foreign civilians, soldiers, and even Chinese Christians for about 55 days. By August 14, the Eighth Nation Alliance, also known as the Eighth Power Expedition, brought thousands of army troops into China to take back control of Beijing. For those who don't know what the Eighth Nation Alliance is or who they are, they consist of Austria, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, UK, United Kingdom, United States, and Russia.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. So let me just go back to this. So all of these nations, plus some other ones, that actually had firm economic interests in China, when the Chinese rose up against them to try and kick them out, they not only crushed the rebellion, but then imposed military control, further weakening the government's control over their country. The result was this. The Qing dynasty, and there's a variety of translations always, but the Qing dynasty came to an end in 1911 when nationalists rose up, frustrated after many years of humiliation at the hands of the West, poverty, economic failure. The monarchy had lost all support, and a nationalist revolution emerged. Now, I would love to say that this was the beginning of a happy ending, that from this point forward, China becomes economically stable, politically stable, and it becomes what we know of today, this economic powerhouse that is raising millions of people out of poverty year after year. Not so much. Between 1911 and the mid-1970s, when China started to, Carla, focus on me. Text later. The mid-1970s is when China began its economic growth that we know of today. 1911 to the mid-1970s. What the hell was going on? Well, we'll get to that a little bit later, but I'll give you this preview. You had the struggle to unify China internally between warlords and the central government. Then you had the civil war between nationalists and communists. And then once the communists take over in 1949, multiple experiments to modernize, revolutionize China that led to a lot of death. In the mid-1970s, that's when you had the beginning of, we need to open up to the West, modernize, capitalize, or introduce capitalism, release the reins of government control on the economy, and then we have what we have today, a nation to whom we owe much money. So, let's go to Japan. Japan is a different case of what to do when the West comes knocking and threatens you with extinction. The Chinese were afraid that if they modernized, they would lose their culture. In the process, well, they lost their monarchy. And they had another 100 years of struggling for stability. Japan saw what was happening to China. And they determined that it wouldn't happen to them. Now, I want to show you this because here's Japan here. It's much smaller than China. But this is a good map because this shows the growth of the Japanese Empire. They went from a nation that was conquered by the Americans in the 1850s, humiliated by the West in the 1860s and 50s, and by the 1890s had begun to be an independent, modern nation conquering its own empire like the other Western nations were doing. How did they go from being victim to victimizer of weaker nations basically in 40 years? First of all, how did they get to be dominated in the first place? And I'm going to come up to Matthew Perry in a moment, so get ready. And Mutsuhito, don't go anywhere. Now then, Japan, like China, was isolated from the West, but for different reasons. The Chinese were isolated because they felt their civilization didn't have anything to learn from the West. Japan, on the other hand, it was much more about power politics, military politics. Japan, like China, had an emperor. But in Japan, the emperor had lost his real political function. He remained a figurehead, someone to worship. Back in the 11th century, the real power remained with the shogun, the military leader, and his samurai, his army. Everyone knows the samurai. If not, do a little Google. Or watch the movie, The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. Does anybody know what I'm referring to?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to make sure that these references are not completely stupid. To maintain power, the samurai had to restrict the importation of modern weaponry. Gunpowder, for instance. Because if you know anything about the samurai, they are experts in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, as well as hand-to-hand combat. All of this is useless when you introduce guns. Because if you shoot Bruce Lee, Kung Fu Master, he'll go down just like anybody else. Right? Now, this is how the shogun maintained power for a number of years. But they also had the same problems with declining agriculture, declining income, famine, and a social and economic imbalance. The best land owned by the fewest people, the majority of people, limited access to land or political power. When the Opium War happened, Japan was going to be next. If China could fall that easily, then why not go to war with Japan to conquer those markets, as well as all those other nations? And then comes Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. Jonathan, who is Commodore Matthew Perry? What did he do?
Born on April 10th, 1794.
Hang on a second. Carla, can you hear him? You weren't paying attention, though, were you? Speak up for the people in the back.
Born on April 10th, 1794 in South Kingston, Rhode Island. He commanded the first U.S. Navy steamship, the Fulton. And he had naval forces in he led naval forces in the Mexican War. Between 1815 and 1833, he was called upon for maritime duties. He fought Algerian pirates in the Mediterranean Sea, helped repatriate African Americans in Liberia, West Africa, and took command of his first ship, the USS Shark, claiming Key West off the Florida coast for the U.S. 1933 to 1844, he was stationed at the U.S. Navy Yard. He helped advance the U.S. Navy by advocating the conversion of U.S. sailing ships to steamships. He also had passing the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, which was in Japan. The United States got two naval ports. They opened up trade with Japan, and also if U.S. sailors their ships got sunk, Japanese sailors had help. He died of rheumatism of the heart on March 4, 1858.
Thank you very much. So a couple of things you mentioned there which are critical. A, he was always involved in critical American overseas expeditions. For instance, you mentioned repatriating African Americans back to Africa. There was one colony in Africa, one nation in Africa that was never conquered by Europeans, Liberia. This was the part of Africa where former slaves were sent back to Africa and was always under American protection. Okay? That's A. B, he claimed territory off the coast of Florida for the Americans, right? And you also mentioned that he was instrumental in transferring the American Navy from wind to steam power. So this guy was on the cutting edge of naval technology and important to the expansion of American military power overseas. And he is the guy that steamed in to the bay of Tokyo Harbor in 1853 and said, the Americans want access to the Japanese markets. You either open up your ports or we will burn Tokyo, your capital, to the ground. Because all we have to do is open fire with our modern Navy ships. The shogun acceded, or said, sure, what choice do I have? The unequal treaties that were imposed on China were imposed on Japan by the Americans and other nations in the future. Ports were opened. You couldn't restrict trade with Japan anymore. Foreigners were allowed to do whatever the hell they wanted, basically. And other nations followed this humiliating exploitation of Japan. But not everybody was willing to lie down and accept what the shogun had done. And for that, I turn to you, Ramir. Talk to me about Emperor Mutsuhito.
Emperor Mutsuhito, also known as Emperor...
Hang on. With gusto. Taste the words in your mouth and project them.
Okay.
Slow down and louder.
Emperor Mutsuhito, born November 3, 1852, was the 122nd Emperor of Japan according to the traditional order of succession. Reigning from February 3 to 1867 until his death on July 30th, 1912. He presided over Japan during the time of rapid change as the nation quickly changed from a feudal state to a capitalist and imperial world power, characterized by Japan's Industrial Revolution. At the time of his birth in 1852, Japan was an isolated pre-industrial feudal country dominated by the Tokugawa shogunate and the daimyo, who ruled over the country more than 250 decentralized domains. By the time of his death in 1912, Japan had undergone a political, social, and industrial revolution at home, called the Meiji Restoration, and emerged as one of the great powers on the world stage. He was called as the Emperor Meiji because of the era, but during his lifetime, his personal name was Mutsuhito. But when he died, he gained the name at Meiji.
Very good. Very good. Very good, very good, very good. Exactly what I was looking for from all of you. Now, those that did not want to cave in to the shogun's decisions, to cave in to the West, had an alternative. They had an alternative. They had the shogun. He was a figurehead, recognized as the leader of the country, but with no political power. What if one were to fight for the independence of Japan in the name of the emperor and give him back real political power that he hadn't had for hundreds of years. This was the result. And so samurai, daimyo, and others rallied around the emperor, and a Japanese civil war emerged between 1858 and 67, and the victors borrowed technology from the West, the guns, etc., to victory in the civil war. And in 1868, the Emperor Mutsuhito was put on the throne with full political power to choose his prime ministers, his cabinet, to begin what we know now as the Meiji era, the era of restoration. What did these people want? Pretty straightforward. They wanted the new Japan to be rich and strong. They wanted an independent Japan, free of foreign exploitation. How do you do this? Unlike China and the self-strengthening movement, adopt Western technologies to strengthen Japan as quickly as possible while preserving the essence of Japanese culture. How do you do this? Well, let me explain. First off, you have to hire foreign advisors. You need these folks to teach you how to organize a modern army, train a modern army, build modern shipyards. And you send your people overseas to go to school, to study other people's ways, to bring it back home. So the borders that kept the Japanese from relating to outside cultures crumbled overnight. They went from, we don't want to have anything to do with anybody, to everybody's welcome and we're sending people overseas to bring this stuff back home. Culturally, this was a 180-degree revolution. This was a cultural revolution, people. And the emperor and his followers did it because they saw what was happening to China and said, that's next for us. What did they do? Political centralization. If you want to reform your country, the government needs to have control over the entire country and its resources. And what Ramir was saying, Japan was ruled in a very decentralized way, where the daimyo, or the nobles, had a lot of power over their lands and they were left alone. But you need to centralize control over all the land, be able to impose laws over everybody, collect taxes over everybody. So how do you do this? These nobles, Louis XIV, he would arrest them, he would bully them, he would bribe them. The Japanese emperor and his cabinet went for the bribery thing. In exchange for you giving up your lands and your power, we will give you pensions, we will give you titles, so you're still wealthy, you just don't have to do the work. So who takes over these territories? Representatives of the government, who impose the laws and collect the taxes as determined by the emperor and his government, ruthlessly, without any exception. The military is modernized and centralized. How? Foreign advisors are brought in to train the army and the navy, as well as the use of new weaponry. The samurai, of course, resist their loss of military monopoly. Because, like I mentioned earlier, being an expert in martial arts, riding a horse, hand-to-hand combat, archery, and using a sword means nothing when you are mobilizing thousands and hundreds of thousands of men that fire rifles, machine guns, and cannon. And if you watch this movie, The Last Samurai, you see this struggle between old and new culture in Japan. Tax reform. How do you pay for all this? You're modernizing your army. You're modernizing your country. How do you pay for all this? Well, you have to collect money. Now, the way taxes were collected in the past, they were done in kind, meaning the tax collector would show up and say, you owe me a number of baskets of grain on this day of the month. And then we will sell it, and that will be the money we use to fund government programs. The problem is, the price of grain goes up and down, so government income was inconsistent. So they switched it around under the Meiji era. The tax collector would show up and say, you owe me this much money. I don't care how you get it, but you owe me this much money. And if you don't, we'll take your land away. So grow more grain. Moreover, land was now assessed at what it could potentially grow not what it was currently growing. What does that mean? If the tax collector comes to you and says, this land can grow twice as much, and we're going to tax you twice as much than what you're paying now, because we know you could do it if you innovated. Well, then all of a sudden you're going to innovate. You're going to adopt modern technologies, modern seed, fertilizer to increase your output because you've got to pay the new tax basis, the new tax rate. Well, why is that good? More taxes, wealthier government. More food, cheaper prices, happier people. Did a lot of people lose their land because they couldn't innovate? Of course they did. But Japan was now feeding itself, and its government income went up, which went into things like economic reform. This is the Emperor Mutsuhito himself. As you can see, fairly well decorated with military regalia because he was the head of the armed forces. In this country, the head of our armed forces is the president. A civilian is the head of our military forces. In Japan, the armed forces did not answer to the civilian government, the prime minister and the parliament. Japan, the military responded only to the emperor. Their budget was taken care of by the civilian government, but their orders came from the emperor. So there was already this division, which later on would be a problem for Japan and really for the U.S. The other reform that the Japanese adopted, which was revolutionary, was political reform. In China, the self-strengthening movement never went very far because the fear was the way society was organized would take power away from the nobles, the emperor, the elites, the wealthy. Japan couldn't afford to move that slowly. So, as Japan industrialized, modernized, a middle class expanded, as liberalism expanded in Japan, the Japanese emperor and his government recognized you have to give these people something. Instead of waiting for them to rise up in rebellion and demanding political rights, a constitution, the emperor bestowed it as a gift to his people. So the emperor bestowed a constitution onto his people, which since he gave it of his own free will, was a very conservative constitution. It laid out the rules, the roles of the government, etc. It was very conservative. The parliament that the people could vote for had very limited power, but it did have one bit of power which in the future would expand and expand. All parliaments everywhere, all congresses, dumas, diets, National Assembly have one power over the budget, taxation. That is non-negotiable. So this was a significant political reform given by the emperor, which still maintained hierarchy in terms of obedience to the emperor, but it also raised up the middle classes, the liberals, brought them into the political system, but all of them trained to obey the emperor, to respect the military, maintaining a lot of Japanese traditions in spite of the quick modernization. Economically, the government did not wait for an industrial revolution to happen, they just did it themselves. The government, with all this new power and money, they built the telegraphs, the railroads, the shipyards, the weapons industry, the steel foundries, the factories, the roads. They built it all themselves. Internally, all tariffs were abolished. Anybody could sell anything in any part of Japan. If it was made in one part, they could sell it anywhere else. So internal trade expanded considerably. Eventually, the government got out of the business of creating a modern economy. Corporations took over, but they were allied to the government and firmly protected by the government so that Japanese corporations never had to worry about foreign competition like other corporations in other countries. Educationally, the Japanese were very, very ahead of their time. They looked around and they said, how do you have a modern economy? You need an intelligent population. Everybody needs to have basic education, reading, writing, arithmetic. But we also need to expand secondary high school education. And we need to expand university technical education. And not just for men. Basic primary education for women as well. That is the only way to be a modern nation and to be on the cutting edge for future developments. The fears that China had, that if you educate the public, they will challenge the existing system of hierarchy, emperor, nobles, and everyone below them, the Japanese met head on, and they did what the Europeans did. They funded public education, but they used public education as a means to teach loyalty. In this country, we teach loyalty to our Constitution, obedience of laws, and a respect for differences in the very schools where we're also teaching critical thinking, blah, 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 blah. The Japanese were not only teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, science, technology, engineering, etc., they were also teaching loyalty to the emperor, loyalty to the military, a respect for hierarchy, respect for elders, not challenging traditional Japanese customs. The result of all this were twofold. On the one hand, the poor, the peasants, and the workers initially suffered considerably. They either lost access to land, they suffer from high taxation, and if they moved to the cities to work in the expanding factories, they weren't allowed to form unions, so they had low wages, long hours. Collectively, for the nation of Japan itself, their inferior status and all these unequal treaties that they signed with other nations were overthrown by the end of the 19th century. They were now recognized as a fully equal nation that you had to deal with equally and sign treaties that were mutually beneficial. And the Japanese started conquering their own empire. They defeated China in the mid-1890s in order to get access to Korea and to spread into northern China or Manchuria. And when Russia resisted growing Japanese territorial conquest, the Japanese defeated the Russians. And just in case you're not quite sure what the hell this means in real life, I don't have that. Let me go back to the beginning. This is Japan. This is Russia. The Japanese defeated the Russian military on the ground, and the Japanese defeated the Russian Navy. They defeated their far eastern fleet, based here. The Russians then sailed their Baltic fleet all the way around the country, and the Japanese beat them too. The Japanese solidified their control over Korea, expanded their interests into Manchuria, which eventually they would occupy. And all of this was happening at a time where racism defined international relations, where the belief was society was defined between the whites up top, followed by everybody below them. And the whites, it was believed, were racially superior and had the right to conquer other people. And the proof was, look how easily we did it in Africa, in Latin America, etc., etc. In China, in East Asia, they were known as the yellow race. But this, in theory, inferior Japanese race, yellow race, defeated white Russians. It completely revolutionized how the world looked at Japan, humiliated the Russians, and led to the end of the Tsar and his absolute monarchy in Russia, which Kropotkin wrote about in his essay. So, with that, thank you. I'm on time. Hand in your homework on the way out, or your extra credits and all that stuff. And I will see you on Wednesday. Does everybody have their marching orders?